The 2025 federal election is over, and I have to say the Liberal Party might be as well if they don't start listening to the messages being sent to them from the past two elections. I don't think anyone other than the most ardent poll denier would have been surprised with Labor taking the chocolates. Aggregated polling was only really trending one way. The only real surprise for me was the margin. To be honest, I'd probably expected the Coalition to pick up a couple more seats than they have. I said in 2022 that the election result then was as much about booting Scott Morrison and the Coalition out of government as it was about anything the Labor Party had put on the table. And for me, a similar vibe really holds true this time around as well. For me, the 2025 election result is really a story about the failure of the Coalition, their failure to learn from their past mistakes. I think it should also serve as a warning that spending too much time within the safe little Murdoch echo chamber can really start clouding your judgment to the point that you're divorced from reality. Listening and taking advice from these pelicans is not a recipe for success. Prior to the election, there were 4 seats I was keeping an eye on: Kooyong, Goldstein, Griffith and Dixon. I'd like to have been able to cover them all in the lead up, but really just didn't have the time. So ultimately I landed on Kooyong again. It made the most sense given I had the background from 2022 and it looked like it was going to be another spicy affair, and Kooyong hasn't let me down. As of recording this, Kooyong looks like it will go down to the wire. Monique Ryan is currently ahead, but I wouldn't like to bet either the London or Canberra investment property on the outcome here. Looks like the Brendas of the world are generally postal voters, which I guess makes sense if you're down at your Portsea weekender. In Goldstein, Zoe Daniel is ahead by less than 100 votes, but with the way postal votes are trending there as well, it's looking increasingly likely that Tim Wilson will snatch victory there as if it were a wreath at an Anzac Day service. I have to say, if Tim Wilson gets back in, people of Goldstein really need to take a good hard look at themselves. Kooyong and Goldstein are both seats that the Liberal Party have felt they own. Losing them in 2022 would have stung, and the Libs have thrown absolutely everything at both those seats to try and win them back, not to mention the support they've received from Advance and the exclusive Brethren. Griffith, I was interested in, as Max Chandler Mather has demonstrated a unique ability to trigger rusted-on Labor faithful as well as the Prime Minister. He's been a fairly polarising figure if you're to believe what you read online anyway. The outcome in Griffith was not all that surprising. The odds were always stacked against the Greens there. Labor were always going to throw everything at regaining Griffith, and then you also had Advance chipping in with their anti-Greens propaganda. It really looked like retaining the seat there was a bridge too far. The interesting part of the Griffith result was, despite losing the seat, support for the Greens there didn't fall off a cliff. It was really the drop in the Liberal vote there that's allowed Labor to shoot past and take back the seat. Here's Samantha Maiden describing the political three-way phenomenon.
When you have these three-cornered contests, right, you don't necessarily have the Greens vote collapsing. What actually happened in Max Chandler Mather's seat is that the Liberal vote collapsed. That's what actually happened. If you go look at the vote that the Greens got in 2022 and the vote that they got in 2025, it's not that different. It's just that when the vote splits that way in 3 ways and the Liberal vote fell, that's what allowed Labor to get up.
Like Stephen Bates in Brisbane, Max Chandler Mather ultimately lost in Griffith due to the collapse in the Liberal vote. Whatever you think of Max or his approach, I hope there's someone in the class of 2025 that's willing to stand up and push the government to do more on housing, because it's blindingly obvious to all but the most partisan Kool-Aid sippers that the government has delivered very little when it comes to solving the housing crisis, and they've put forward very little to shift the dial in the next term as well. Sorry if that offends, but housing really is one of those areas in which the Liberal Labor shit light tag is more than appropriate. Finally, we have Dixon. Before election night, I didn't have Dutton losing his seat on my bingo card, even though it's always been relatively close there. The difference this time around was that an independent candidate had thrown their hat in the ring, and this really shook things up. Labor taking the seat will be the headline, but don't overlook the contribution of the independent there in dislodging one of the more divisive politicians in recent memory. The Liberal Party just won't survive if they're unable to work their way back into metropolitan seats. That much should be abundantly clear. The fact that the safest Liberal seats in the country have now become incredibly marginal, if not being lost completely, should be a wake-up call. I mean, it should have been a wake-up call last election, but clearly it wasn't. Dutton spent 3 years huffing his own farts, barely setting foot outside his safe place. Once he stepped out of the echo chamber, he looked woefully underprepared and policy free. There wasn't a policy announcement he wasn't prepared to walk away from, and it was almost like the coalition's research was to dump a policy out into the wild, gauge the public reaction, and then walk it back very quickly if it wasn't a winner.
If the election's about cost of living, you tell me how you guys keep losing poor old seats where people are struggling.
I think the really interesting thing
Why are you
will
going to get
be
your
tonight
head
whether the strategy that Peter Dutton
Why are you going to get your
tonight whether the strategy that Peter Dutton.
Did the Trump effect play a role? No doubt. Despite their protests, there is clearly an element within the coalition that would love to go full Trump, which appears to be spurred on by the support of Gina. And even more remarkably, after the result on Saturday night, we have Liberal senators popping up with this sort of thing on the Sunday.
What we have to do is make sure that we make the Liberal Party great again. I said it, there we go. So we can make Australia great again, by the way. And no one should have any backlash about that. That's a simple statement. Trump himself said it during the American campaign. Why are they getting stuck into this slogan? Who doesn't want to make America great again?
I mean, what's the level beyond doubling down? If the Liberal Party think this is the pathway to victory, then they may well be on track to become a minor party very soon. And for all his bluster about doing a deal with Trump, it turns out that Trump doesn't even know who Dutton is, as if that should really be a surprise to anyone. In the lead up to election day, as the polls all started to point to the same result, I'd occasionally see people posting on Twitter in disbelief. How could it be that Dutton was heading toward defeat? I think the answer to that is pretty simple. Once an election is called, whether you're the Prime Minister or the opposition leader, there's nowhere to hide. People were given the opportunity to see Peter Dutton daily, and the more they saw of him, the less they were inclined to vote for him.
This is a bit edgy, but I've been really thinking about the fact that Peter Dutton always thought the media were too hard on him. I think in many ways the media were too gentle with him. And I think he wasn't stress-tested enough before they got to the campaign. Stress-tested on the policies, but also on his positioning. And I think if there'd been more of that stress testing, they would have been readier for the campaign.
The coalition will lick their wounds, and it'll be interesting to see where they decide to go from here. Are they going to listen to the lessons of the past two elections or drift further out to the political fringes? Looking at the list of potential opposition leaders, it does not exactly fill me with confidence. For Labor, they can celebrate a thumping win, but I don't think it'll escape anyone at their HQ that their thumping win has come despite only registering around 1/3 of the first preference vote. It's a reality that the other vote has continued to grow. As far as the country goes, I think we can expect more of the same. Labor held a majority in the lower house in their first term, but did little more than tinker around the edges of some of the country's bigger issues. With an increased majority this time, I'd hope that it would empower them to be a little bolder and demonstrate a little more courage and ambition in trying to tackle the big stuff like housing this time around. So here's hoping that the government steps up, because if they just roll out more of the same, I fear it'll be another term largely wasted. When you find yourself in the position to make real and lasting change and you just opt to run with the status quo, I think you're really just holding power for power's sake at that point, which all in all seems pretty sad.